Is inflation really on track to halve in the next year?
I think it will, because I think that global energy prices are falling. I think a lot of the supply chain issues, the post-lockdown lingering difficulty that many countries have of producing stuff and services, which the Chancellor rightly referred to, I think those are receding. Those supply chain knots are definitely easing. But today's number is a disappointment. The CPI was still 10.5% higher in December 2022 than it was in the same month the year before. In the US, inflation is now down at 6.2%, much lower, which is why a lot of people think the Federal Reserve, their big central bank, the most important central bank in the world, will now start raising interest rates, but by less, smaller increases in response to this disappointingly small drop in inflation this morning. On the one hand, this isn't going to ease industrial relations at all. We can talk about that, but when it comes to the Bank of England and interest rates, so important for savers, but also borrowers, mortgage holders, I reckon when the Bank of England next meets to set rates on Thursday, the 2nd of February, there was hope there'd just be a quarter-point rise, a much smaller one, because inflation seems to have peaked. But because inflation's coming down slower than a lot of people expected, we could see another hefty half-point, 0.5 percentage point interest rate rise.
To some extent, a lot of criticism of the Bank of England for not going as early as the Federal Reserve did in the United States and not going as far.
Some of us were saying well over a year ago, Tom, as you know, that inflation was going to be very, very serious, and we were derided when we said the idea that this inflation would be transitory was not true. It strikes me also that this industrial action, the biggest wave of industrial action we've had since the 1970s, there was a sense that the government could say, look, inflation's falling, you don't need, a double-digit pay rise. But, we're still in double digits.
Yes.
So the Labour Party, the trade unions have been out immediately after this number saying, of course you need these big, hefty double-digit rises. And what the Chancellor was trying to say in that film, in fact, I didn't think he quite got to the nub of the problem. What you've got to convince the public of is that if the public sector awards massive double-digit pay rises, that won't only mean more taxes, more borrowing, which is inflationary, that increases firms' costs, the government's interest rate payments and so on. It will also be copied across the rest of the economy, because the 4/5 of us in the private sector will start demanding those
up. And the
massive
private sector pay rises have been much less than double figures.
Well, it's complicated, but the point is that if you have big rises across the private sector, firms have to pass a big chunk of that higher wage bill on, which then leads to higher prices for goods and services, which then leads to higher wage demands. We get a 1970s-style wage price spiral. This is not an academic theory. This is what often happens when you get rising industrial strife. And I think today's interest rates number, today's inflation number, and the prospect of higher interest rates, and indeed the continued cost of living squeeze, will mean that the industrial action that we thought would ease could remain pretty tough.
That's a really stark assessment. But let's look at some more of the communication that the Chancellor has been putting across this morning. Not only a piece to camera in the Treasury, but also a quirky little video in a coffee shop where he explores what he says are the big drivers of inflation. Let's take a little look.
There are lots of reasons why inflation has risen. One of them is COVID. When we found a vaccine and came out of lockdown, global supply chains struggled to cope, and that pushed prices up. Another is Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which pushed global gas prices to their highest ever levels. And finally, even after gas prices have started to come down, economists say that energy prices will remain high for some time. And all that means that the price of a cup of coffee has gone up.
Well, looking there at the prices of a cup of coffee, it's a relatable thing, but it's interesting. The three things that the Chancellor said were COVID, were the war in Ukraine, and were energy prices, I suppose, linked to the first two. But he didn't mention government borrowing, and he didn't mention the Bank of England printing a lot of money. Should he?
Yeah, there was a lot of sort of rhetorical sleight of hand in what he said. I mean, you and I know more than anyone, Tom, how difficult it is to talk about complex things in small amounts of time, right? I mean, that's what I'm doing now, and what you're doing now, of course. He says, oh, global energy prices are coming down. absolutely. The gas price in European wholesale markets now is 55 euros per megawatt hour, down from 350 euros back
it's about
in
the
August.
level before it was when Russia invaded.
And 150 euros in December. So it's coming down very cheap. Still high by historic standards, but you're right, below where it was in the months immediately before Putin invaded Ukraine. And then he says, oh, but economists say energy prices that you pay will stay high. Well, you can't wish that away, Charles. All right, you know, where's Ofgem making sure that these energy wholesale price reductions are being passed on to consumers? You know, where is some kind of government minister saying to the petrol retailers, look what's happened to oil prices, they're way below where they were before Putin invaded, and yet petrol prices are higher and diesel prices are higher still. So I had that issue with that little video,
yes.
But I also, like you, thought it was a huge omission to not talk about quantitative easing, an issue I've been talking about for many, many years. I do think this massive increase in the money supply, the Bank of England expanding its balance sheet, basically creating money from nowhere, not printing physical notes, but creating money, the Bank of England's own balances, using it to buy government bonds, that money going into the economy. Before COVID, a lot of that quantitative easing stayed within the financial system, and that meant that stocks and shares went up, house prices went up, particularly at the sort of upper end where lots of financial people were buying upmarket houses. The difference between pre-COVID era quantitative easing and post-COVID era quantitative easing, and we did more quantitative easing in the 2 years of lockdown than we did in the 10 years leading up to lockdown. But it's different because that COVID era quantitative easing, it went directly to firms to pay for furlough and households for business support loans and so on, and higher benefit payments, and so that money
so it's sloshed around the real economy.
It doesn't stay inside the banking system. It doesn't stay inside the financial system. It's gone straight into the bank balances of firms and households.
And as the former governor,
as it's spent, it will prove to be inflationary.
As the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, said just a few weeks ago, you had too much money chasing too few goods as a result of that. Will the Chancellor ever accept this?
No, of course he won't, not while he's Chancellor, because quantitative easing was, in effect, a very, very political thing, and it does really challenge the idea that the Bank of England is independent, rather than just creating money to get a government in a tight corner off the hook. Look, you have to take my word for this. There was a major House of Lords inquiry, which admittedly I gave evidence to, but that was chaired by Michael Forsyth, Lord Forsyth, the former cabinet minister. But people on that committee included the likes of Mervyn King, the likes of Lord Skidelsky, some very serious economic thinkers, some world-class economists, and they call quantitative easing a dangerous addiction. And they talked about the fact that it's challenging the independence of the Bank of England and that we will live to regret it. I do think there's a lot of inflation in the system because of QE, but I must say I did expect this number today, 10.5%, to be slightly lower. I'm surprised, given this massive fall in energy prices, that inflation for now is proving so sticky.